The first thing I saw when I walked into the pantry was Frank's hand on Clara's waist. Her back was pressed against the shelves, her head tilted slightly toward him. She wasn't pushing him away. She wasn't even pretending to resist. Instead, her lips were curled in that small, knowing smile I hadn't seen in years, a smile that used to be mine. I froze, gripping the doorframe. For a moment, the world around me seemed to stop. Then Frank noticed me. He straightened but didn't step away, didn't look embarrassed or guilty. Instead, he smirked, like I'd caught them sharing a private joke. "Nick," Clara said, her voice sharp with panic, "it's not what it looks like." "It's exactly what it looks like," I replied, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. Frank raised his hands, stepping back casually. "Relax, Nick. We were just talking." His tone so calm, so confident made my blood boil. Clara's eyes darted between us, her cheeks flushed, her hands trembling slightly. "Talking?" I said, taking a step closer. "Is that what we're calling it now?" "Nick, please," Clara started, her voice trembling. But I wasn't interested in her excuses. That night, she didn't come to bed. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every moment of the day. Clara's smile, Frank's smirk, the way her body had tensed when I walked in, it all pointed to one undeniable truth. She was cheating on me. The thought was like a knife twisting in my gut. I'd built this life with her, poured everything I had into our diner, our home, our marriage. And now it was crumbling, piece by piece. But it wasn't just the affair that haunted me. There was something else, something about Frank. He wasn't just some drifter passing through town. There was a weight to him, a sense of purpose that didn't belong in a man who claimed to be looking for a fresh start. I couldn't shake the feeling that he had brought trouble with him, and that Clara was right in the middle of it. The next morning, I found Frank's bag in the storeroom. It was tucked into the corner, half hidden behind a stack of crates. I wasn't looking for it, I hadn't even planned to come into the storeroom, but when I saw it, curiosity got the better of me. The zipper slid open easily, and what I found inside made my stomach turn. A stack of cash, neatly bundled and far too large to be honest earnings. A small black notebook filled with names and numbers, each one carefully crossed out. And at the bottom, a photograph. It was Clara. Her hair was shorter in the photo, her smile wider. She was sitting on the hood of a car, her arms slung casually around Frank's shoulders. They looked happy, comfortable, like they'd known each other for years. When Clara came into the diner later, I didn't confront her right away. I wanted to see how far she'd take it. She acted normal at first, chatting with the customers, wiping down tables, laughing at the regulars' jokes. But every now and then, I'd catch her glancing toward the kitchen, her expression tight, her movements hurried. When the last customer left and the diner was quiet, I pulled the photograph from my pocket and slapped it onto the counter. "Explain this," I said, my voice low and cold. Clara's face went pale. For a moment, she just stared at the photo, her hands trembling slightly. Then she looked up at me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place: fear, guilt, and maybe just a hint of defiance. "Where did you get that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Frank's bag," I replied. "The one he left in the storeroom, along with a stack of cash and a notebook full of names. Care to explain what it's all about?" Her lips parted, but no words came out. She looked like a deer caught in headlights, her mind racing to come up with an excuse. Finally, she shook her head. "It's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is," I demanded. She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the counter. "Frank, then? We knew each other before I met you. It was a long time ago. He just showed up out of nowhere. I didn't know he was coming. And the money?" Clara flinched. "It's his. I don't know where he got it." I didn't believe her. Not for a second. But before I could press her further, the bell above the diner door jingled. Frank walked in, his expression calm as ever. He glanced between us, his smirk widening when he saw the photo on the counter. "Guess the secret's out," he said, his tone maddeningly casual. "What secret?" I snapped, rounding the counter to face him. Frank shrugged. "Clara and I go way back." "She didn't tell you?" "We were thick as thieves once." I shot a glare at Clara, who looked like she wanted to disappear. She said she didn't know you were coming, I said, my voice tight. Frank laughed. Oh, she knew. She just didn't expect me to stick around. Before I could respond, Frank reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He tossed it onto the counter, his smirk never wavering. Since we're being honest, here's something else you should know, he said. I unfolded the paper, my stomach sinking as I read the words scrawled across it. It was a map of the diner, complete with exits, storage locations, and a large red X over the pantry. What the hell is this? I demanded, my heart pounding. Frank leaned against the counter, his eyes gleaming. It's a little plan Clara and I were working on. A way to make a clean break. Clara's voice broke through the tension, trembling and desperate. Nick, it's not what you think. I didn't agree to it, I swear. But her words fell on deaf ears. For the first time, I saw the full extent of the betrayal, not just the affair, but the lies, the schemes, the danger she'd brought into my life. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't just about saving my marriage. It was about saving myself. I stared at the map Frank had thrown onto the counter, the red X glaring back at me like a wound that wouldn't close. Every line, every mark screamed one thing: betrayal. Clara didn't just cheat on me, she'd been plotting something far worse. You're insane if you think I'm going to let you walk out of here with her, I said, my voice low and dangerous. Frank shrugged, his smirk unwavering. Walk out with her? Nick, you're missing the point. This isn't about you. It never was. Clara and I have business, and you're just standing in the way. I glanced at Clara, hoping for some shred of humanity, some spark of remorse, but she didn't meet my eyes. She just stared at the floor, her lips pressed into a thin line. Clara, I said, my voice sharp. Tell me the truth. What's really going on? Her head snapped up, her eyes filled with panic. I didn't want this, she said quickly. I didn't know he'd show up. I thought it was over. Frank laughed, cutting her off. Over? You don't get to walk away from something like this, Clara. We both know that. The doorbell jingled and all three of us froze. Sheriff Hayes stepped into the diner, his sharp eyes scanning the room. He didn't miss the tension, the way I stood between Clara and Frank like a barrier ready to collapse. What's going on here? Hayes asked, his tone calm but heavy with authority. Frank's smirk faded, replaced by a mask of disinterest. Just grabbing a bite to eat, he said casually. Hayes didn't buy it. His gaze flicked to me. Nick? I hesitated, my mind racing. I could tell him everything about the money, the map, the affair, but something stopped me. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was fear, or maybe it was the sinking realization that Clara had dragged me too far into this mess to turn back. It's nothing, I said finally, forcing my voice to stay steady. Just a disagreement. Hayes arched an eyebrow, his skepticism clear. A disagreement, huh? Funny, because I just got a report about an abandoned car near the woods. Belongs to someone named Frank. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? Frank's smirk returned, smaller this time but just as infuriating. Must be some other Frank. Hayes didn't leave. He sat at the counter, watching us like a hawk as Clara busied herself with wiping down tables and Frank leaned back in his chair, pretending not to care. I stayed silent, my hands gripping the edge of the counter so tightly my knuckles turned white. The minutes dragged on, the tension suffocating. Finally, Hayes stood, his hand resting casually on his belt. Well, I'll let you all get back to your disagreement. But don't go anywhere. I might have a few more questions later. As the door closed behind him, Frank turned to me, his smirk now a full-blown grin. You really should have told him, Nick. Might have saved yourself some trouble. That night, Clara and I didn't speak. She avoided me, retreating to the kitchen while I sat in the empty diner, staring at the map. I traced the lines with my finger, my mind spinning with questions. What was in the pantry? What had they been planning? And why did Clara let it go this far? I couldn't take it anymore. I stormed into the kitchen, the map crumpled in my fist. Tell me what's in the pantry, I demanded. Clara froze, her hand gripping the edge of the counter. Nick, please stop lying to me. I shouted. I've given you every chance to tell me the truth, and all you've done is lie. What's in there? Her shoulders sagged, and for a moment, I thought she might finally come clean. Then she shook her head. It's nothing. Just supplies. I didn't wait for her to finish. I grabbed the keys from the hook by the door and unlocked the pantry. Clara shouted something behind me, her voice frantic, but I didn't stop. The hidden compartment was easy to find, a loose panel in the floor that I'd never noticed before. I pried it open, revealing a metal box. Inside was more cash stacks of it, bundled neatly, and a second notebook. This one wasn't filled with names. It was filled with dates, locations, and cryptic notes that made my head spin. Clara's voice trembled behind me. Nick, I can explain. I stood, holding the notebook. Explain what? That you've been running some kind of operation out of my diner? That you've been lying to me for years? Or that you're still in love with him? Tears streamed down her face, but I didn't care. I'd had enough. I packed a bag that night. Clara begged me to stay, swore she'd make things right, but her words rang hollow. The woman I thought I knew was gone, replaced by a stranger with secrets I couldn't begin to understand. As I walked out the door, Frank was waiting. He leaned against his car, his arms crossed, his smirk as infuriating as ever. You're making a mistake, Nick, he said. Clara's not who you think she is. Neither are you, I shot back, my voice cold. But at least I know where I stand. Frank's smirk faltered, but he didn't say anything. I climbed into my truck and drove away, leaving them both behind. For a moment, I thought it was over. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw Clara step out of the diner, her face illuminated by the dim glow of the sign. She wasn't crying anymore. She wasn't begging. She was smiling. And I knew deep down that this wasn't the end. I didn't make it far. The weight of what I'd uncovered pressed on me like a boulder, making it impossible to think straight. The notebook, the cash, the look on Clara's face as I left, all of it churned in my mind as I drove aimlessly through the dark, empty roads. By the time the sun began to creep over the horizon, I found myself parked at the edge of a rundown motel outside town. I should have kept going. Instead, I sat there, gripping the wheel, replaying everything in my head. Clara's betrayal wasn't just about Frank anymore. It was deeper, darker. The notebook was proof of that. Each scribbled entry hinted at something bigger, something planned. And if she was involved, how far had she gone? I couldn't let it go. By noon, I was back in town. The diner was quiet when I parked across the street, the closed sign swaying gently in the breeze. Through the window, I could see Clara moving around the kitchen, her movements slower than usual, as if the weight of the night before was finally catching up to her. I didn't go inside. Instead, I waited, watching as she worked. Hours passed before she finally locked the door and walked out, heading toward the back alley where Frank's car was parked. I followed her. She didn't notice me as I slipped into the shadows, keeping my distance as she climbed into Frank's car. They drove out of town, taking the back roads toward the woods. My stomach churned as I tailed them, staying far enough behind to avoid detection. They pulled into a clearing, the car coming to a stop near an old, abandoned cabin. I parked my truck out of sight and crept closer, the rustling leaves muffling my footsteps. Frank stepped out of the car first, his casual demeanor replaced by something sharper, more serious. Clara followed, clutching the notebook I'd left behind. "This is all of it," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "All of it?" Frank repeated, his tone skeptical. Clara nodded. "The money, the notes, it's everything we have. We just need to figure out how to deliver it without getting caught." I leaned against a tree, my heart pounding. This wasn't just about running away with stolen cash. They were trying to make a deal likely with whoever had funded their scheme in the first place. As I listened, the details of their plan began to emerge. Frank had been using my diner as a front, moving money and information through the kitchen pantry's hidden compartment. Clara had been helping him, feeding him details about my schedule, my routines, ensuring I wouldn't stumble onto their operation. But things had gone sideways. Someone had caught onto their scheme, and now they were scrambling to clean up the mess. Frank lit a cigarette, exhaling slowly as he looked at Clara. "You sure Nick's out of the picture?" Her hesitation was brief but telling. "He's gone," she said. "He won't come back." The lie hit harder than I expected. Frank smirked, taking a long drag. "But He always seemed like dead weight to me. Clara didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the notebook in her hands. I had heard enough. I crept back to my truck, my mind racing. Confronting them now would be suicide. They were desperate, cornered, and likely armed. But I wasn't walking away, not this time. If they wanted to use the diner as their playground, I was going to turn it into their trap. That night, I returned to the diner. The place felt different now, colder, like every familiar surface was tainted by their lies. I went straight to the pantry, opening the hidden compartment and removing what little cash was left. Then I started rigging the place. I loosened the screws on the pantry door so it would jam shut if someone tried to open it too quickly. I adjusted the lights in the kitchen to flicker unpredictably, creating just enough confusion to give me the upper hand. And in the corner of the pantry, I placed a small recorder, one of those cheap voice-activated devices I'd used years ago to catalog inventory. If they came back, I'd have everything I needed. I didn't have to wait long. The next night, Clara and Frank returned, their voices low and urgent as they entered the diner. I hid in the storeroom, watching through the crack of the door as they made their way to the pantry. "This better still be here," Frank muttered, pulling open the hidden compartment. "It is," Clara said, her voice shaky. "Nick didn't know about it." Frank chuckled darkly. "You underestimate him. Guy's smarter than you think." For the first time, Clara didn't respond. I stepped out of the storeroom, the revolver in my hand. "Smart enough to know when I'm being used," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a blade. They both froze, turning to face me. Frank's smirk returned almost instantly, but Clara's face twisted in panic. "Nick," she said, taking a step forward. "This isn't what it looks like, Dash." "Save it," I snapped, raising the gun. "You had your chance to come clean. Now you're going to tell me everything, or I'll make sure neither of you leave this diner." Frank raised his hands slowly, his smirk faltering. "Easy there, T. Let's talk this out." "Start talking then," I said, my grip tightening on the gun. For the first time, the truth came tumbling out. Frank admitted to using the diner to launder money for a syndicate, small sums disguised as legitimate business expenses, passed through the hidden compartment in the pantry. Clara had been part of the operation from the beginning, using her position as my wife to ensure I stayed in the dark. But the scheme had gone south. The syndicate wanted their cut, and Frank had gambled too much, keeping more for himself than he should have. Now they were all targets, and the notebook was the only leverage they had left. "You dragged me into this," I said, my voice trembling with rage. "You used me, used my diner, everything I built. For what? A quick payday?" Frank shrugged. "It's just business, Nick. Don't take it personally." Clara took another step forward, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't know how to stop." I shook my head, lowering the gun. "You don't get to be sorry. Not anymore." Before I could decide what to do next, the sound of tires screeching outside snapped all of us to attention. Frank's face went pale as headlights swept across the diner's windows. "They found us," he muttered. The front door burst open, and the first man through wasn't there to talk. The front door slammed against the wall, the sound reverberating through the diner. 3 men stepped in, their movements sharp, deliberate. They weren't here to negotiate. The leader, a tall man with slicked back hair and a leather jacket, scanned the room with cold, calculating eyes. His gaze settled on Frank, and his smirk widened. Well, he drawled, his voice dripping with menace. "The prodigal son returns." Frank froze, his cocky demeanor evaporating in an instant. "I was going to pay you," he stammered, taking a step back. "I just needed more time." The leader chuckled, pulling a cigarette from his pocket and lighting it with a practiced flick. "Time's up, Frank." I stood near the pantry, gripping the revolver tightly, my heart pounding in my chest. Clara was beside me, her face pale, her hands trembling. She whispered, "Nick, we have to get out of here." "We're not running," I hissed back. The leader's eyes shifted to us, his smirk deepening. "You must be Nick," he said, exhaling a cloud of smoke. "The poor sap who got dragged into this mess." I'd say I'm sorry, but, well, I'm not. "What do you want?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. He tilted his head. "Frank owes us. Big." And you've been playing house with his accomplice? His eyes flicked to Clara and she flinched. So, I'm thinking you're all part of this now. We're not, I said firmly. I didn't know what they were doing until it was too late. The leader took a step closer, his expression darkening. Doesn't matter. You're in it now. And someone's got to pay. Before I could respond, Frank bolted. He darted toward the back door, his footsteps echoing loudly in the empty diner. One of the men cursed and took off after him, leaving the leader and his other associate with us. The leader sighed, shaking his head. Coward. Always running when things get tough. He turned back to us, his smirk returning. But lucky for me, I've still got you too. I raised the revolver, aiming it directly at him. You're not taking anything from us? His associate moved faster than I expected, lunging at me with a knife. I fired without thinking, the sound deafening in the small space. The man dropped to the floor, clutching his leg and screaming in pain. The leader didn't flinch. Instead, he clapped slowly, his smile widening. Not bad, he said. Maybe you're not as soft as I thought. Clara grabbed my arm, her voice panicked. Nick, let's go. We can't stay here. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. Get out, I said, my voice steady, the gun still aimed at the leader. He didn't move. Instead, he flicked his cigarette onto the floor, grinding it under his boot. You've got guts, Nick. I'll give you that. But guts don't mean much when you're up against people like us. He took a step forward, his tone darkening. You think this ends here? You think shooting one of my guys scares me? You're in this now. You heard all of it. And you're not walking away clean. Before I could respond, the back door burst open. Frank stumbled in, blood dripping from a cut on his forehead. He looked wild, desperate, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. They're coming, he panted. More of them. We've got to get out of here. The leader's smirk faltered for the first time. More? What the hell are you talking about? Frank didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed Clara's arm and pulled her toward the front door. We're leaving. No. I hesitated, my grip tightening on the revolver. We're not going anywhere with you. You don't have a choice, Frank snapped. If you stay, you're dead. The sound of screeching tires filled the air as more cars pulled up outside. Headlights flooded the diner, casting long shadows across the walls. The leader cursed under his breath, his composure finally cracking. This isn't over, he said, pointing a finger at me. You think you can outsmart us? You'll regret this. He grabbed his injured associate and hauled him to his feet, retreating toward the back door. Let's go, he barked. As they disappeared into the night, Frank turned to me, his expression desperate. We've got to move. No. I didn't trust him. But Clara was already pulling me toward the door, her voice frantic. Nick, please. We can't stay here. Reluctantly, I followed, my mind racing as we sprinted out of the diner and into the woods behind it. The trees closed in around us, the darkness thick and suffocating. What now? I demanded, my voice sharp. Frank didn't answer right away. He stopped to catch his breath, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to appear out of the shadows. We head to the cabin, he said finally. What cabin? Claire asked. Frank's eyes met hers, his expression serious. The one we planned to use if this all went south. I clenched my fists, anger boiling under the surface. You had a backup plan? And you didn't think to tell me? Frank shrugged. You weren't part of the plan, Nick. You were just a tool to keep things quiet. His words stung, but I didn't have time to dwell on them. The sound of voices echoed through the woods, distant but growing louder. We don't have a choice, Clara said, her voice trembling. We have to go. The cabin was small and weathered, tucked deep into the woods. Frank unlocked the door with a key he pulled from his pocket, his movements hurried. Inside, the air was stale, the furniture covered in a thin layer of dust. This'll hold us for a while, Frank said, slamming the door shut. For a while? I snapped. And then what? Frank didn't answer. Instead, he pulled a map from his jacket, spreading it out on the table. We'll make contact with them. Offer a deal. The notebook and the money in exchange for our lives. No, I said firmly. I'm done with your deals. We're getting out of this my way. Before Frank could argue, the sound of footsteps outside silenced us. Clara's eyes widened, her hand gripping my arm. "They found us," she whispered. Frank grabbed the revolver from the table, his jaw tightening. "Stay quiet," he said. But it was too late. The door burst open, and the fight for our lives began. The door slammed open, wood splintering under the force of a boot. The cabin erupted in chaos. 2 men stormed in, guns drawn, their movements quick and calculated. Frank reacted first, firing off a shot from the revolver. The bullet missed, slamming into the doorframe, but it was enough to force them to duck for cover. "Get down," Frank barked. Clara and I hit the floor, the sound of gunfire tearing through the cabin as bullets shattered windows and splintered furniture. Frank dove behind the table, reloading the revolver with shaking hands. "This is your plan?" I shouted, crawling toward him. "Get us killed in a shootout?" Frank didn't respond. He fired again, this time hitting one of the intruders in the shoulder. The man cried out, dropping his gun and stumbling backward. The other man returned fire, the bullet grazing Frank's arm. "Stay low," Frank yelled, clutching his bleeding arm. Clara was huddled in the corner, her face pale, her breathing shallow. Her eyes locked onto mine, wide with terror. "Nick, we can't stay here. They'll kill us." "No kidding," I muttered, glancing around the room. The cabin wasn't just falling apart from the firefight, it was a death trap. The flimsy walls offered no protection, and the windows were shattered, leaving us exposed. We couldn't hold out for long. My gaze landed on the back door, partially hidden by a tattered curtain. It led to the woods, a potential escape route. "Clara," I called out, keeping my voice low. "When I say run, head for the back door." Her eyes darted to the door, then back to me. "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you," I promised. Another round of gunfire erupted, and Frank cursed under his breath. "We can't hold them off," he said. "There's more coming. We need to move." I nodded. "On 3. 1, 2. Before I could say 3, Frank pushed past me, making a break for the back door. "Frank, wait!" I yelled, but he didn't stop. One of the intruders spotted him and fired. The bullet caught Frank in the leg, sending him crashing to the floor just feet from the door. He screamed in pain, clutching his thigh as blood pooled around him. Clara screamed, her hands flying to her mouth. I grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the door. "Go, now." We scrambled toward Frank, who was still writhing on the floor. I grabbed him under the arms, dragging him the rest of the way. "Keep moving," I shouted to Clara. She hesitated, her eyes flicking between me and the woods. For a second, I thought she might leave us behind. But then she nodded, pushing through the door and disappearing into the trees. The intruders were closing in. I could hear their boots crunching on the broken glass, their voices barking orders. "Leave me," Frank groaned, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Shut up," I muttered, hauling him outside. The cool night air hit us like a slap. I dragged Frank into the woods, the darkness swallowing us whole. Clara was ahead, her silhouette barely visible as she wove through the trees. "We can't outrun them," Frank panted. "They'll track us." "Then we make sure they don't," I said, my voice grim. I found a small clearing and set Frank down against a tree. He winced, clutching his leg, but he didn't complain. Clara caught up to us, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. "What now?" she asked, her voice shaking. I didn't answer. Instead, I turned to Frank. "Tell me everything. No more lies, no more half-truths. Who are these people, and why are they after you?" Frank's jaw tightened. "They're part of the syndicate. I was moving money for them, using the diner as a front. But I got greedy. Took a bigger cut than I should have." "And Clara?" I pressed. Frank hesitated, his gaze flicking to her. "She knew about it. She was supposed to help me keep you in the dark." Clara's face crumpled, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Nick, I didn't want to." I dashed. "Save it," I snapped, cutting her off. A branch snapped nearby, the sound freezing all of us in place. The intruders were getting closer. "Nick," Frank said, his voice low. "You've got to take Clara and run. Leave me. I'll hold them off." I shook my head. "I'm not leaving anyone behind." "You don't have a choice," he insisted, his voice fierce. "If they catch you, it's over. Take the notebook and go. It's your only chance. I glanced at Clara, who was staring at Frank with wide, disbelieving eyes. You're staying? Frank nodded, his jaw set. I got us into this. It's the least I can do. Before I could argue, the sound of voices grew louder, closer. I grabbed the notebook from Frank's jacket and turned to Clara. Let's go. Clara hesitated, her eyes locked on Frank. Nick Dash. Now, I said firmly. She nodded reluctantly, and we took off into the woods, leaving Frank behind. The sounds of gunfire erupted moments later, echoing through the trees. Clara stumbled, her sobs breaking through the night. I grabbed her arm, pulling her forward. We can't stop, I said. But Frank Dash. He made his choice, I said harshly. Now we make ours. By the time we reached the road, my legs felt like they were on fire, and my chest heaved with every breath. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, and I stepped into the middle of the road, waving my arms. The car slowed and I braced myself, unsure if it was friend or foe. The window rolled down, and Sheriff Hayes' face appeared, his expression a mix of relief and frustration. Get in, he said. As we climbed into the car, I handed him the notebook. This is what they were after, I said. Hayes glanced at it, then back at me. And Frank? I shook my head. He didn't make it. Hayes' jaw tightened, but he didn't press further. As the car sped away, Clara sat silently beside me, her face streaked with tears. I stared out the window, my mind racing with the weight of what we'd left behind. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The ride back into town was silent. Clara sat in the back seat, her head resting against the window, her tear-streaked face hidden in shadows. Sheriff Hayes drove with grim determination, his hands tight on the wheel. I sat in the passenger seat, clutching the notebook like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. The plan was simple, at least in theory. Hayes would take us to a secure location, far enough from the syndicate's reach, and we'd figure out how to leverage the notebook against them. But as the road stretched on, a nagging doubt clawed at the back of my mind. Frank's sacrifice hadn't felt like closure. It felt like the beginning of something worse. We reached the safe house, a small, dilapidated cabin on the outskirts of town. Hayes handed me a burner phone and a slip of paper with a single number scribbled on it. Call me if anything changes, he said, his tone clipped. I'll keep the notebook safe. You two stay put. I didn't ask where he was going. Part of me didn't care. As long as he kept the syndicate off our backs, it didn't matter. Hayes left, his headlights disappearing into the darkness. Clara and I sat in the cabin's cramped living room, the tension between us palpable. She was the first to speak. Do you hate me? She asked softly. I didn't answer right away. My gaze lingered on her, taking in the woman I thought I knew. The woman I'd trusted with my life, only to find out she'd been lying to me from the start. I don't know, I said finally. But I don't trust you. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. She knew better. The hours dragged by, each one heavier than the last. Clara eventually fell asleep on the couch, her exhaustion overtaking her guilt. I couldn't sleep. I paced the small cabin, my mind racing with everything that had happened. Frank's betrayal. Clara's lies. The notebook. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't solve. Then I noticed something. Clara's bag was partially open, a corner of fabric sticking out. It wasn't much, but it was enough to catch my eye. Curiosity won out over caution. I crouched down and pulled the bag toward me, careful not to wake her. Inside was a folded piece of paper. I opened it and my heart sank. It was another map, this one marked with a new location, one I didn't recognize. Scrawled across the top were 3 words, "Final pickup, Clara." My mind reeled. This wasn't over. Clara had been lying to me again. She wasn't running from the syndicate, she was still working with them. I stood, my breath shallow, my hands trembling. Part of me wanted to wake her up, demand answers, but another part of me knew it wouldn't matter. Clara would say whatever she needed to survive. I had to act. The sound of a car approaching snapped me out of my thoughts. I peeked through the window, my heart pounding as I saw headlights pulling into the driveway. Not Hayes. 2 men stepped out of the car, their silhouettes illuminated by the porch light. They moved quickly, their footsteps heavy against the wooden steps. I grabbed the revolver from the table and shook Clara awake. "They're here," I whispered. Her eyes flew open, panic flooding her face. "What do we do?" I didn't answer. Instead, I pressed the revolver into her hands. "You're going to explain everything to them. If they're here for you, I won't stop them." Her jaw dropped, her expression one of pure betrayal. "Nick Dash." "Enough," I said coldly. "You've lied to me for the last time." The door burst open, and the men stormed in, their guns drawn. Clara raised her hands, the revolver trembling in her grip. "I have what you want," she shouted. "It's in my bag." One of the men grabbed the bag, rifling through it until he found the map. His eyes scanned it, his lips curling into a smirk. "This'll do," he said. "But the boss isn't done with you yet." They grabbed Clara, dragging her toward the door. She screamed, twisting and fighting, but it was useless. She turned to me, her eyes pleading. "Nick, help me," she cried. "Please." I stood frozen, the weight of her betrayal holding me in place. The man carrying the map paused, glancing back at me. "You're lucky," he said. "We've got what we came for. But if you get in our way again, you won't be so lucky next time." I didn't respond. I just watched as they dragged Clara into the car and drove away, her screams fading into the night. The cabin was silent once they were gone. I sat on the couch, my head in my hands, the revolver still cold in my grip. For the first time, I felt free. Clara was gone. The syndicate had what they wanted. Frank was dead. And I was still standing. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Clara might have been the catalyst, but I'd seen too much, done too much. The syndicate wouldn't forget me. And I wouldn't forget them. And that's the end of today's story. If you enjoyed this journey, please give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories like this one. Got thoughts or experiences you'd like to share? Drop them in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.